All right, ladies and gentlemen, man, it's another Tuesday. Time just flies by, and we have had way too many weeks go by without checking in with our friend from MSP Radio, the one, the only, Mr. Dave Sobel. How you doing, Dave?
I'm great, George. Nice to be back, as always.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, I feel like, the news cycle, I mean, has just, been on fire since the last we've talked. There's so much to talk about. We may kind of need to do rapid fire, to be honest with you, because there's just so much that's happened.
Or dive into one or two of the ones that you think are the most important. We can go or the audience, if you've got anybody listening has one they want to get an opinion on, because I suspect there's even stories you want opinions on that I didn't cover.
well, let's start here, right? So
sure.
one of the big things that we ended on last time we talked was $MSP. Well, guess what? It happened. It didn't change. Right. Now it's out there. What other feedback from that story is out there, or have we already just covered it all?
Well, so from a feedback perspective, I mean, it's interesting to me that I mean, it was one of the best covered pieces that I've done, right? So it's got very, very wide reach and clearly influenced a lot of MSPs thinking. And I'll start by saying, like, look, for me, that's always the point, right? Is to understand something and you form your own opinion. You can think I'm wrong, that's totally cool. But if you didn't know about it, didn't think of it, that's what I'm trying to deal with. And so, I mean, look, it was very polarizing. People are on both sides of that. Some people saying, saying it is a big deal. Others that aren't. I can tell you from a data perspective, their search traffic has gone up. I'm watching it. So say what you will. I was right in that their search traffic on MSP managed services, that all goes up. I'll also observe, look, I am no financial expert, but when I look at the investment community, they've all said, meh, it was an IPO. I mean, I've heard comments anywhere from, well, that was disappointing, to, well, they did all right considering what they do. And so I maintain a couple of statements on this. First, I was right. They've totally taken that MSP traffic. I can see it in the data. Whether or not you think that matters, that's up to you, but it happened. The second is, I hate to say it, but I was also right from this is no endorsement of the managed services space. And if it is, it's a shitty one because investors are not falling all over themselves going, this was like the IPO of the year. The volume's kind of low. The stock price is fine. It's not dropping. It's also not going up crazy. It's fine. It's a perfectly fine investment. So if you're looking for this massive endorsement of managed services, it ain't there. So again, it's all like, what do you think is important about this? Look, it's a company going out there with some profitability. They did pretty well with their service offerings. Market didn't tank on it, so that's a win. But I'm not going to sit here and go, that was explosive victory.
Yeah, I get it. So it'll be interesting to see how this goes moving forward. As you said, the stock price really hasn't shifted much since it's gone public. If anything, it's gone slightly down from when it started.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing about it is the volume is not particularly high. Again, I'm not a financial investment expert, right? So if you want to an actual, we should probably, I continue to talk to those people to get their insights. And that's where I'm coming from. But I look at it and go, the volume is not particularly high. It's not like driving a bunch. It's not buzzy. It's not, and all the analysts that I look at from this perspective are just going, again, there's nothing wrong with being middle of the pack. Not everything has to be explosive growth, right? You don't necessarily take a company out and it quadruple. It hit most of its expectations. Cool, right? Okay. Yeah. What I want of people is to not read too much into it. Like I said, there are some pundits and analysts in our space that were running around saying this is just a total endorsement.
No. Well, I'd be curious to see, Dave, SolarWinds still is talking about, I'm sure at some point we'll see if they break their companies into two separate and, the MSP versus non-MSP division. I mean, and obviously there's still the other two of the big four out there, right? I mean, I have heard some rumors on the rumor wire that, imagine a scenario if two of the four jam together. I mean, what does that look like?
Well, okay, so I mean, and look, I'm happy to make predictions for people like that because it's half the fun, right? And the reason is because the prediction is almost less important than you understanding my reason, right? Here's the logic to it. SolarWinds is totally going to spin that off, right? Like totally. Now, in disclosure, I'm a shareholder, right? Like, so let me know. I hold SolarWinds stock, so I think that's important for you to know that, like from that perspective. And I will always disclose if I own something, from that perspective. I think totally they're going to spin it off. I actually think it makes, if you look at it from that public market perspective, you have two different business models in that current business. You have the MSP, which is a subscription channel driven business, versus kind of their product business, legacy software business. Now, admittedly, they're converting that to a subscription model, but that is a much more kind of mature product line versus a growth product line. And so business-wise, at a real high level, like shoving them together may not have made sense. This is them saying like saying we're going to do something different. If we go back to the press releases that they put out 3 years ago, 4 years ago, when all of this happened, it's like, well, we're going to bring these product lines together. Okay, none of that happened. So a change in direction, that's totally reasonable. Like, I don't want to be taken as bashing it. You can say we were doing something, didn't pan out the way that we thought it was going to. Now we have a new plan. Cool, right? Like if you're a small company, that would be a totally reasonable set of statements. We're working a plan, didn't quite work out the way we wanted to, going in a new way to find new value. Hey, cool. So I predict they're totally going to do that. They will absolutely 100% spin that off. And if I'm wrong, let's find out why, right? Like down the road, because I'm sure it'll come along. Then you talked about so there's rumors of the combinations. Well, of course they're talking about figuring out what they're going to do. All of the investors are trying to take these pieces and combine them in ways that make the most sense. They're trying to figure out if 1 + 1 is 3. So of course there's some thinking about that. Do I necessarily think that there's going to be a massive roll up of any of those big four? Not particularly. The two that are publicly traded, probably, maybe they buy somebody, but I just think that the finances on that don't make a ton of sense to me, because it's such a large check to write. And if their goal is kind of revenue acceleration and cross sell, which I think is what they would be going for, it just doesn't make sense to me. But
sorry about that, Dave.
Yeah, no worries.
A little bit of technical difficulty. All right, so we'll see how it all goes. I'm curious. Time will tell. And so let's move on to a couple other things. One, we talked about 4G and 5G and the fact that what's advertised.
Yep.
And then on
I've lost you there, George. Now, while you're catching up, I will fill in a little bit here for you. The thinking, I think where you were going with this is we talked a little bit about 5G and 4G previously. And some of those conversations are around, what the opportunity is. And in particular, I've been critical of some of those larger telcos for not really kind of investing here. Some of the new updates, I put out a video this past weekend that actually did some roundup from the election. There you go. Are you back? Cool. I put out a video this past weekend, in terms of a roundup of some of the 2020 election results. If you haven't caught it, I cover a lot of things. And look, everyone, we've got a big federal level election, right? That's actually, from a solution provider perspective, less important. Like, there's a lot of local issues that came up that are way more important that I think are worth thinking about. So, for example, you brought up 5G. One of the things that was particularly interesting to me is that they're passed in Denver. Voters opted out of a law prohibiting the use of tax dollars to build a municipal internet. So what that means is, normally, if the way these are structured, of course, is that a telco will do a deal with a city and they'll do some kind of deal for like, hey, we'll have the rights to build out your infrastructure. We'll supply you with things like, television support for your school systems, or subsidized internet, that kind of stuff, right? And it will put in place that kind of deal blocks a city from building their own internet. Well, in Denver,
Yeah, that happened. That happened in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh with Comcast a few
yep,
years back.
yeah, it's very typical, right? And this is how these kinds of laws have actually, or what's created a lot of these monopolies and duopolies in a lot of cities and rural areas. Well, Denver said no. Denver's actually voted to say that they're not going to prohibit the use of tax dollars to build their own internet. Now, will they do that? Don't know yet, right? But they're open to it. They're intrigued at it. And last I checked, Colorado pretty open-minded on a lot of these things. You can look in other areas of law, perhaps in the area of legalized marijuana, to give you some kind of sense of the way those voters were thinking. But here's the other detail of this. A referendum in Chicago came back where 90% of voters believe internet access should be a public utility.
Oh.
Right. That was my reaction too, is okay. Oh, voters are saying loud and clear that, that we ought to be looking at the internet as a utility. If you didn't catch it this week, the New York Times had a really big story talking about some of the significant problems in rural internet, particularly that have been exposed now about online learning, the number of kids that are left behind. We've talked about it before in these calls. I talk about it all the time on the show. Right. And I think what I look at this and say is that there is a shift in mentality going on around people treat the internet and their thinking of it. I'm going to come out very boldly and say, like, look, I'm at the point now where I think we put internet in the same category as electricity, water, and the postal service. Like, I want these delivered as a core infrastructure. The same way that I want roads delivered as a core infrastructure.
I would think there's a lot of lobbyists out there that don't agree with your stance.
Well, last I checked, voters matter. And if enough, look, and they do, and you see it in these referendums, and you see the pushback.
I mean, Dave, I don't want to get super political, but I mean, IT is in the middle of this election. I mean,
sure,
if votes matter, are they actually tabulated properly?
Well, but think about this again. We're thinking about it from a tech services perspective.
Okay.
Particularly our audience, right? People that are delivering technology services. Imagine if you actually could depend on broadband to be everywhere.
Sure.
Like, really could be everywhere. Like in rural areas of America, of the far reaches, that it could be delivered in lower income communities, in minority communities. Like, you could serve more customers. You could sell all of our services, right? I mean, BVoIP services could be sold in more areas. Remote monitoring and management services, MSP services, all of that would have more potential customers. So I'm making the case of, like, from our perspective, we should all be very for this. This is good for our businesses if we could eliminate the variability of internet connectivity.
Fair. Well, I mean, there like when T-Mobile and Sprint merged, I guess part of their deal from a federal government standpoint was they're giving away 10 years of service to first responders for free.
Yep.
And as well as 5 years of service to educational markets, right? So
yep.
It'd be curious to see how the big guys step in and fill the gap in until, like, the actual coverage changes. Because here's the reality. I mean, as you said, along the major metros and the suburban areas, yeah, we have some pretty good connectivity. Not in between, right? Not in between the big cities, for sure.
Right, but even in urban areas, we're not necessarily serving lower and middle income communities and particularly lower income communities. And I would make a pretty good argument that how are you supposed to build businesses? How are you supposed to build modern, technology driven businesses in the current climate if we don't supply that? How many of us have all said every business now is a technology business, right? We're constantly saying that, right? Well, if we don't give them the basic technologies, it's like denying them roads and electricity and water. Like, of course, they're not going to build a business there.
I think to some degree, Dave, and listen, again, not trying to get super political, but I think that when this is all said and done, right? When this pandemic is behind us and everybody is either in a place where they have a vaccine or have access to vaccine, whether they take it or not,
Yep.
I think there's going to be a 2-year education gap where these people didn't learn or didn't meet the minimum standard of learning.
Right.
And that's a problem because you can't repeat, like these grades aren't being repeated, right?
Well, exactly. And by the way, bad for business. Everybody out there, we're constantly bemoaning the skills gap, right? We're now essentially saying we've got a group of people that are going to come through the system where we didn't invest enough in them. You don't think that's going to catch up with us business wise? If you've been around for a while, like anyway, you're right. We're not trying to be a political, but most politics at some level are actually local, and we need to focus on these issues at a local level and really understand that what we can do in our own communities. When I bring up the idea of talking about internet connectivity as something that you can do, that's done at the local level. That's done in your town. That's done in your city. That's done in your county. That's done there. That's a local politics issue. That is something that, right, small businesses have every right to be involved with. And I make an argument of, by the way, it's good business. We want to create these good business environments too.
But Dave, you're saying it's a good business, and then you have a session about don't start an MSP.
Yeah. Well, so my funny thing about I had such fun writing the don't start an MSP. And here's where my thinking is, right? Is I'm a big guy to read all the forums, right? So I like the Facebook groups, the Slack groups, the Discord groups, like if you've got a community out there and you want me to listen in, I love to be. So it's open invitation. If you got one of these groups, I love being invited because I love listening. I'll contribute where it's useful, and if you've got something you need from me, I'm happy to do it. What I watch is I watch consistently, particularly like during a pandemic, right, where people lose their jobs or things get rough, and entrepreneurs get creative. So they'll go, I'm thinking about starting an IT services company. I'm going to help people with technology. And what happens is it's inevitable, right? I can practically write it. Somebody posts, hey, I'm thinking about starting an MSP, or I want to come and get some information about starting an MSP. And everybody starts with, oh, well, you need to go buy these 4 products, and you need to, you're going to build a gold, silver, bronze. And like the answers are so rote and so straightforward. And none of them address the actual core problems of being an MSP today. Like, you really ought to figure out insurance. You need to understand what the regulatory market looks like, not just because our own space is getting regulated, but like you're probably going to deal with some customers who are regulated too. Oh, and by the way, you really ought to know that you're wading into the security nightmare that is being a small business right now, where you're going to be pummeled, right? I've got long-standing MSPs that are telling me I spend all my days on security issues. Like that's what they spend their time on, is fighting security. You ought to know that. Hey, by the way, you got to figure out that E&O insurance, errors and omissions insurance, way more expensive than it used to be because the insurance companies are on to all of this. Like there are real challenges. Now, I love this space. I love helping small businesses with technology. But what I want to recognize is that it is way harder than it used to be in this space, like significantly harder. And if you don't spend time thinking about these things, the risks are actually significantly higher than they were before. So I started my MSP in 2002, right? Like the worst thing I could probably do is lose somebody's data, right? That's the worst thing I can, and that's pretty bad, right? I'm going to definitely say like that's pretty catastrophic. But right now, I could do everything right, and I could still lose because of the security compromises, or I could be sued, or I could do data, like have data breach problems, or I could like just make an honest mistake in something like that and have everything about the business fall apart because of insurance problems or a failure of my execution. It's just so much more difficult. And I don't like when we are welcoming new members to the community by saying, oh, just go buy these 5 products and you're done. We are doing them a disservice.
Well, it just goes to tell you, Dave. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I run into an MSP who bought their stuff 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, and they still haven't onboarded.
Right.
It doesn't. Just swiping the credit card doesn't guarantee anybody anything.
Exactly. And so for me, it was a piece of everybody. There's all these pieces out there of how to start your MSP, starting up a new MSP. Hey, I've even got one too. Like this, if I was starting an MSP, this is what it would look like today. But I really wanted to have a conversation around, let's actually address what the challenges of this business model are, like what they fundamentally are. That isn't to say don't do it. It's a, you really ought to understand these and think about these questions when you build your business plan. Oh, by the way, most are not building a business plan, right? But here are the questions you should ask yourself about this
Fair,
before you start an MSP.
fair. All right. But so pivoting here,
Yeah.
you write a no to robots, yes to automation, and online events are working. Come on, Dave.
So it's there are some spaces where online events are working. Like,
I'd love to see it.
well, it's about measuring what that means, right? So you're actually kind of lumping a couple of stories together. So let me take a moment and break those out.
Okay.
So there was an organization that did a study around how online events are working. And actually, they said 93% of the respondents said that the greatest appeal of virtual events is networking. Now, my quick observation as a data analyst on that is well, 93% of people say the greatest appeal is networking. That means somebody's doing them. Now, this is industry, like this is event wide. This is a broad swath survey. This is not surveying like IT channel events or MSP events or any subsection. This is across the entire space. Some of them say that the convenience of digital events has made it easier to attend. They say the ability to attend more events is actually a key reason for their popularity. So what I'm saying is what I'm looking at this saying is you've got to focus on distilling events into their core value to deliver them well, right? You need to provide focused, good content that allows people to and then also potentially to interact with the speaker and with one another. So for example, I mean, we're doing one right now, right? I'm actively watching the chat screen with the people that are showing up because this is an opportunity to talk with people and meet other organizers. If you're watching this as a video later, my information is like right there at the bottom here, right? You know, my name, like you can find me, you can Google me. Like you should use this as an opportunity to find people online. What I think, and by the way, you and I have had lots of offline discussions about how some of these are really bad. Where I think it fails is people that are trying to forklift an offline experience into online. Right? That's where I'm going to take what works physically and I'm just going to try and recreate that, right? Trade show floors and walk the booths. Well, you don't do those things online, right? You don't. But what you can do is you can have, really dynamic small group discussions, or you can get much more intimate access to speakers, and they are much more willing to do that. And by the way, people like me that do kind of events, we can do more of them, right? Some of the major speakers are all looking and saying, instead of flying around and doing keynotes, they'll do 2 or 3 speaking events in a day from the convenience of their home, talk to people online, and then be home for dinner. So
Yeah,
there's some of that stuff.
I just think there's a bit of Zoom fatigue that's still all in there, Dave.
I do not disagree with that. But what I'm also saying is people will show up for good stuff, right? Like for good information. There are organizations that are doing a great job. Let me point to, the kind of the premier organization for that. Apple has done 3 events where they would have generally only do 1 or 2 in the fall in terms of rolling out their new products. What's interesting is that they have compressed those down. What used to be like a 3-hour presentation, the last one was 63 minutes. It was way shorter. So they're tightening up the content, way focused on it, and then opportunities for online interaction. So that's what I'm saying. Like you have to do the legwork of reevaluating this, and the people that are just trying to forklift their existing stuff and their old pricing models too, like that's what's not working. Now, You asked about the no to robots. That's a kind of an interesting other story that's related to this. Walmart has thrown out or ended their program testing autonomous robots in about 50 of their stores. And what those robots were doing is they were going around and they were scanning items, checking stock levels, pricing, misplaced items, all that kind of stuff, right? The idea behind the pilot program was that we were going to reduce the load on humans and reduce labor costs. Cool idea, right? Well, they ended it. And the reason they ended it is because since the pandemic and the shift to online ordering, Walmart has found out that their workers, the people that are running around the store doing prep for online delivery and pickup, could do inventory and could do that same work as part of it. And then they did the analysis and said, hey, it makes more sense just to use humans for this.
Okay, that's good to know.
Right. And that was my take on it too. And what I loved about this story was they used metrics to make this decision, right? They were measuring the way their labor costs, they were measuring the productivity of their people. And they said, you know what, this pilot program, when compared against what our new business looks like, because we pivoted, time to roll that back. And what was, and so I looked at that and I said, like, the first bit was like, hey, they use metrics to this. We all quip about KPIs and management, but this is an example of managing to metrics. I love that about it. And the second is, by the way, technology is not always the answer, right? They looked and said, humans make perfect sense for this. We're going to use people for this job. I love that. Like, it is
good.
Right.
People finally won. I'll take that win every day of the week.
I'm 100% with you. And so that was where those particular stories were coming from. So is the idea of, we're going to actually take a moment to think about those kinds of things, make business decisions based on business metrics, not because the tech is cool.
So let's make business decisions. Why do you think we're going to have a K-shaped recovery? And if so, what does that mean for tech services companies?
So for me, I did a video on this, and I would, if you're interested in the topic, dive into it, because I spent a little bit of time briefing through it. But the first is to actually talk about what a K-shaped recovery is. And the idea behind the K is we're always trying to recover, to graph out growth, right? And we like to say, is it a V, right? So it gets really bad and then it gets better. Or is it the W, right? Where it got bad, it got a little better, then got bad again, got a W. Well, a K is the idea that it's actually going to start splitting. That we're going to see some industries, some businesses really accelerate, and we're going to see other ones do very, very poorly. And that, for me, I like making predictions because I want to help people to understand where my thinking is and why I'm making the decisions that I'm making. Because I think that's the piece about it. So I'm predicting a K-shaped recovery and it to go on for a little while. Because people were asking, like, what is it going to look like? What's going to happen? The first is I did want to outline, and in the video, I walked through some of the current jobless data and what it means, like previous recessions compared against this one in terms of job numbers. And they're just strikingly bad for people that are the lowest earning workers. It's just bad. Like, we just have to acknowledge that it is not going well if you are in the lower tier of employment. Now, look, we are technology people. We're in one of those industries that is doing reasonably well. And what's actually, I pulled some additional information from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and broke down, which breaks down which industries are recovering very well, technology being one of them, but also which ones are in industries really needing assistance. Some of them like travel, entertainment, hospitality, food services. Again, it's a little obvious when you think about it, but what's happening there is those businesses are just doing really poorly. And it's probably getting worse, particularly as we think about going into the winter and we're looking about, we have not been through a pandemic during the winter months. We haven't done that yet. Here we go, everybody. We're on the roller coaster. We're about to go over the edge and going into the winter. What I walk through on this is a breakdown of where I think that's going. I actually do project we're going to have a lot of business failures. We're going to have a lot of, like, IDC is projecting 30% of small businesses will fail by 2021. 100,000 businesses have already gone out of business. Like, The problem is not evenly distributed among industries. So my advice for solution providers continues to be, what I want you to do is I want you to do a deep dive into your customer base, not just to understand your customer, but your customer's customer, to really understand how they make money. By the way, this is really good exercise because it'll help you be really close to your customers. You'll be able to do really good consulting with them about projecting the way their business is going to go, how technology can work. You need to get really hands-on with your customers and their industries. So for example, if I serve the legal profession, right, I want to understand, well, what kind of law do they specialize in? Who are their customers? You know, if you're in the legal space and your customers are technology companies, that's probably really good space to be in. If you are legal and and their customers are restaurants or service industries, like, they're probably looking on a rough time here. And you want to understand that, because at first level you might say, well, I serve lawyers. Well, we got to understand what their industries are, and you want to go a little bit deeper to that. And that's the bit where I think about the idea of getting that understanding is really important. The other thing, and look, we're not talking politics here, but I also want to observe that there's a fine line between politics, leadership, and citizenship, right? And I think it's important, like, if you don't necessarily have to be a politician to be a leader, and citizenship is also important at very much at a local level. This does tie together. You can be engaged in your local community as a leader, which is good for you and your business and your community, and stand for something. Business leaders are having increased pressure to do that. And I think that's really important. You know, you can separate that out a little bit. There is a difference between politics and local leadership. You can step forward and believe in something in your local community, and that's really powerful.
No, I get it. I understand where you're coming from. I'm still a little bit more hopeful, but hey, that's my prediction versus yours. All right.
Well, right. I mean, and look, we've talked about this a little bit. I try and be a realist, right? And I differentiate I can be hopeful and realistic at the same time. I'm actually 100% confident that this will end.
It has to end.
Well, but George, but this is actually an important mental exercise for us as people to talk about.
Sure.
I can be 100% confident that this will get better. This is going to get better. What I need to be realistic about is my timelines, right? I need to be planning from the perspective of, I want to be realistic. I don't want to be over aggressive. I don't want to be over optimistic and run the risk of running out of cash, depending on customers that aren't there, depending on deals that won't come through. I don't want to risk that, because I got to survive, right? I got to get my business through to the other side in order to continue to serve my customers, to be a part of the community, to keep food on the table. Like, I've got to be realistic about it. And if I set arbitrary deadlines to this, then it could all fall apart because my plan isn't good. I can be hopeful for the future, yet realistic about my current situation. This is a video I've talked about in the past, this idea of the Stockdale paradox. You really do have to embrace this idea of, I can keep both ideas at the same time.
Okay, fine. What do CEOs want, and customer experience? And then on the tail end of that, you said 2 election results focused on, but I'll let you figure out which one you want to talk about. I think what do CEOs want is a good one.
So the question is, what are CEOs focused on for next year, was the particular story that we're talking about. And I love spending time thinking like a CIO and digging into CIO data points, because, and we talk about this in our space all the time, right? If you're the trusted advisor or a virtual CIO, well, that really means is you ought to be thinking like a CIO and understanding what other CIOs are talking about. So dive into some of the data around this. So following this year, 43% of CEOs expect to return to revenue growth in 2021. And they're actually projecting it to exceed 2019 levels. 1/3 of CEOs expect to restore growth in 2022. A third of CEOs are planning a cautious restart when tackling COVID-19 and the economic crisis, while 44% expect to more quickly regenerate business, according to some data from Gartner. And about 10% plan to be more conservative, focused on survival. Right? So that's kind of a sense of what we're thinking about. Gartner has some specific recommendations about scaling your digital efforts downstream and making sure that they are continued to be out through the entire organization. Working with the CEO to understand plans to restore or redesign the business and determine where digital efforts fit in. And to focus, of course, on CEO demands, helping COOs with productivity, and help CFOs maintain cash on hand. So you look at that and say, okay, this is a stack rank of CEO and CIO style priorities. This translates perfectly into SMBs, right? Because this is exactly what SMB business owners are going to be thinking about. This is a pretty fair set. I can extrapolate and say those business owners look a lot like these mid-market and enterprise CEOs based on what we're talking about. They have many of the same concerns. And so for me, I look and say this list of recommendations is like your to-do list if you're a tech services firm, right? We like to talk about these ideas of quarterly business reviews and stay really close to your customers. We'll go in there and do what Gartner is recommending. Makes perfect sense to me. Work with the CEOs, the business owners of your customers, and understand how to restore or redesign their business using technology, right? We can get into really tactical kinds of things, like if you're in the retail and services business and you're working with restaurants, you probably spent a lot of time getting them into online ordering, right? Making sure that that was all set up earlier in the year. Well, now, are they thinking about the way that they're going to do that on the other side? Right? If you're a restaurant, you're trying to get through to the other side of this, you're probably heavily emphasizing online ordering and delivery, but maybe you're also going to move toward kind of some of these new hybrid models, right? Where it's like maybe you were going to allow people to do more fast casual on a small basis, or order ahead, or order pick, like customize, those kinds of things. And you can think about that with any business, right? One of the big benefits we have now of lots of people, we throw everybody into work from home, but we're finding the companies that are working really well are the ones that are re-engineering their businesses, not just throwing people from at home, right? Worrying about how do we do remote promotions? How do we do remote reviews? How do we get staff to be more engaged? How do we make sure that we continue to invest in culture? On the other side, are we going to go fully virtual? Probably not, but we're also probably not going to go fully back in the office. We're probably going to have these hybrids, right? Where there's creative time, there's collaborative time, and there's time outside. Well, you've got to think about the systems and the processes that pull all this together. And I look at this and just say, this is all consulting opportunity, right? Everything I'm talking about here is stuff that you can go in and work with your customers, charge them to help them do, because the good ones are going to do really well on the other side.
No, fair. That's good. So you did right. Coming back towards kind of forecasting what a CEO, CIO, CEOs, look for next year. You had an article on IT operations in 2020, which then coupled with the DOJ takes $1 billion, could be intriguing. And then I thought was really interesting, new rules on text, email, and IM, which are kind of really important now. So please do tell.
So again, we want to dive into some of those new rules. The new rules were interesting to me because it was a big shift in the way people are thinking about communication. So the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has issued their final rule that outlines how debt collectors can use text, emails, and instant messengers.
Oh.
There are no limits to the number of messages collectors can send, but it does require that each message come with instructions on how to opt out. The Bureau also limits the number of times someone can be called to 7 calls per week from a debt collector.
Okay.
I had to laugh and go, that seemed like a lot to me, but I'm not in the debt collection business, so I guess that makes some level of sense.
Fine.
For me, this was a little bit tech adjacent, was the way I described the story, right? Do I expect that a bunch of IT solution providers are going to take advantage of this rule? Nah, that's not where my head's at. But what I was intrigued by is the changing nature of communication used by these debt collectors, right? Debt collectors, we can get a sense of what that industry is like, even if we're not experts in it. The fact that they're now using text and instant message to communicate with, with their debtors shows that shift in communication. And we talk a lot about customer experience. We talk about the idea of going where your customers are. And here was one where I was like, you know what? I really liked this way of thinking to say, you know what? Am I thinking about communicating with my customers in all the ways that they want to communicate with me? Here's a really tactical kind of thing, right? We all are very dependent in the managed services world on tickets, right? Everyone likes talking about tickets, create tickets, make tickets. And we've really been traditionally focused on these ideas of doing it via email or via phone. Well, maybe we ought to be looking at chatbots, instant messaging communication, looking at text information. There's a vendor in this space, the folks at Gazinta do their Tix product is focused on this particular solution. So there's areas here where it's like, I, as an IT solution provider, really need to think about the way that I communicate with my customers to make sure that I'm in their spaces, right? That I'm making it easy for them to be my customer, easy for them to reach out with me and communicate the way they want to be communicated with. That's the idea of customer experience. And so for me, this was one of those stories where it's like, look, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau recognizes that this is the way communication is done. Big government agency letting debt collectors use it. I want to encourage solution providers to make sure, are you thinking this way too? Are you really thinking about the way you can make communication with your customers and potential customers really easy?
No, that's good. No, I appreciate that thought. So, and I think we already touched on laws and changes tech services companies care about.
Yep, we talked a lot about that one. So that again, I would there's a bunch of different pieces in there. Like, for example, if you're not aware of some of the stuff that's happened in Massachusetts around right to repair, there's that. Portland, Maine banned facial recognition, and there's penalties around that. In Michigan, the state constitution was amended to protect electronic data and communications from unreasonable search and seizure, the same way physical papers are done. It's the first law of its kind in the country. Like there's a lot of these local laws. Obviously, we spent a lot of time on the election. You could view it as a completely political thing and say like all the presidential election is all that matters. What I would say is go listen to my video. I walk you through a bunch of different laws that happen in local levels that you as an IT provider really ought to know about.
Might need to just catch up on all of that, because who knows what's happening in your backyard, right?
Well, exactly. And look, this is what happens at elections, right? Like a lot of this stuff happens. We get very wrapped up in these big national issues. Those are important. But if we're looking at this just from a business perspective, and we as IT solution providers, there's a lot of things that changed after the election. We really ought to figure what those mean. Your job, your value as a provider is interpreting technology and linking it to business. Look, the regulatory landscape matters. That matters to you.
I agree. So this is an interesting one. To couple it with don't start an MSP, the lie and fallacy of as a service.
So again, the idea here is to really think about this. Now, for me, obviously, I am highly opinionated, right?
Yes, Dave. I think we know this.
But I'm self-aware, George. I am self-aware, and that's my point. And but I also want to make sure that I have space for other opinions, right? Because again, the idea is to think this through and make an understanding. In this particular case, I wanted to highlight what Mike Norris said, and he's the head of Computacenter, which is Europe's largest reseller. Okay, so he came out in a recent format. He actually said that the idea of selling tech based on consumption is a lie and a fallacy created by marketing machines at some of the largest hardware vendors. So I'm going to read you the quote. He goes from him, if I was a vendor, I would want a consumption model. I see absolute logic in why I would want to sell as a service and not sell capital goods. He said, I do think vendors have to be careful because I don't think customers want to buy it that way if they can avoid it. And he said, some vendors were fixated on consumption models. So I put this out because for me, I'm a fan of everything as a service. Like as a solution provider, I sold it this way. I believe in the idea of consuming things. So I actually disagree with Mike Norris, right? I disagree with that. But that being said, we want to make sure that like not all, you've got to challenge this. You've got to make your own decision. We both know there are guys out there selling transactional that are doing just fine in business, right? They are selling hardware, they are selling software, they are not moving to a consumption model, and there are customers that want to consume it that way. Whether or not that's a growing number or a shrinking number, we could have a smart debate over that. But I certainly won't say nobody. And he's probably right to say that there are ones out there, right? But I was left with two big takeaways. The first is I want to recognize that vendors do promote what they want. They do, right? So, and by the way, it's not a bad thing. It just is a thing. You have to recognize that, of course, your vendors are going to promote what they want you to do because it is in their best interest. It may align with your best interests if you're a solution provider. It may not. You, the solution provider, are responsible for interpreting that advice and understanding if it is true. It's not the vendor's fault, right? It is. You do not blame your vendors for suckering you in. No, you are in charge of your own business. You have to take it.
You vote with your wallet. No, I mean that's what it comes down to.
George, I'm 100%, but I think it's important to recognize that sometimes we forget that the vendors are looking out for the vendors. It is not a bad thing. I am not casting aspersion. I am stating it as a fact, right? And you, the solution provider, have to watch out for that. And by the way, the second point, the reason why I thought this was important is the data tells me that the best performing solution providers have a mix of hardware, software, and services sales, and they are not exclusively services, right? The mix matters. And it's interesting because for me personally, we get in the DeLorean and we go back to 2008, 2009, when I was talking about managed services. I was convinced in the earlier days that a pure services model was the best model, right? The new data has emerged and I was wrong, right? Hey, George, it's important. But it's important to recognize that, right? I try and be smart and humble enough to recognize that when there is new data, I want to interpret that and I want to make course corrections based on that. It's all about fail fast, right?
Sure.
Fail fast.
Fair
it's
enough.
Okay. It's okay to be wrong.
Okay, Dave, I'm writing this down, Dave. I'm gonna
please do. Please do.
So moving along, video chat platforms are a thing.
Yeah, so this is one of my areas where it's where I'm thinking a little bit about the transition. One of the things that's important for me is this move of platforms. I did a recent editorial talking about where the platform has moved. Again, we get the DeLorean, we go back in time, we talk to early solution providers. It was, you built your business around the platform that was Windows, right? That was the platform you built your business around.
Yeah.
Well, the numbers don't say anymore that Windows is the dominant platform, right? Because it isn't. Actually, Android is technically the dominant OS platform. And the marketplace is actually pretty diverse. I mean, we could remember when Windows was 95% of the OS market. I want to say it's like 33% now. In the video, I've got the particular stats. Android's like 35% of the market. The market looks, from a platform perspective, very different. And I would argue that it has moved higher up, that you're building your business around the idea of a business platform, something like Microsoft 365 or Google Workplace or some business platform. It could be Teams, Or it could be like a Zoom or a GoToMeeting or a communications platform or your unified communications platform, right? You could build your business around that level. Um, and I what I was observing here is this GoToMeeting had some data about the massive growth, right? And the fact that the number of meetings that were on mobile grew from 5% to 12%. And weekend meetings grew from 3% to 8.5%, right? But what's also happened is at the same time, Zoom launched a platform for live events and a marketplace for third-party applications that you could bring right into the Zoom meeting environment. And what I'm saying is I want people to think about these conferencing technologies not necessarily as a standalone product, but what they're trying to be, which is a platform for delivering business around. Exactly, a platform in quotes. And I want people to think about that they're building their businesses on a platform higher than the platforms they were building on before. I still talk to, and I'm sure you do, solution providers who are still very fixated on the OS level of stuff. And I would make, a bit of a flippant argument, but intentionally done so, is like, does anybody build a business around TCP/IP? No.
It's just kind of expected, Dave.
So do you build a business around an OS anymore?
No, I think you have to start building a business around outcomes.
Exactly. And that happens on a higher level platform. And that's where my head's at on this one. So I wanted to offer that I think, I'm not necessarily saying I would do this or this is my lead idea, but I'm saying there are going to be businesses that spring up built entirely around the idea of delivering on top of the video chat platforms. I could build an entire event style business or delivery of integration services all on top of Zoom.
And there are some. I'm not saying they're great, by the way, but they're there.
Right. I think the growth is in that space. And so I'm highlighting it because, again, I'm just trying to make sure people are thinking about this in new ways. What's the next platform or the new platforms to build on? It's clearly M365 Good Workspace. These video chat platforms might be part of that. Maybe it's an extension. Maybe you're on M365 and it's Teams, right? You go all in on Teams. Maybe it's Google Workspace and Meet. Maybe it could just be Zoom. I just want to make sure that there's opportunity here. And I'm always on the hunt for, like, where are these things? This felt like one to highlight.
Okay, let's number one. Thanks, Dave, for chatting in. He says he loves your high-tech museum behind you.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for that.
So there's that. Let's end on, and I'm sure, listen, we'll consolidate it into the chunk that it needs to be. The channel is an overloaded term.
This is again, sometimes sometimes me, I just got to poke at things, right? Mm-hmm. So for me, and I'll summarize this in our last couple of meetings, I spotted this hashtag out on LinkedIn called Save the Channel, right? And save the channel, save the channel, save the
watchtower.
Totally save the watchtower. It's all along the watchtower. But the idea here was, and I dug into it, and I was like, I didn't understand it, right? Because I kept looking, like, what do we mean? Who are we saving? Like, I don't get it. And what came to light to me was the fact that there was a group of people that do consulting in the space, and their definition of channel was like the channel salespeople that work within a vendor. It's a totally reasonable definition. Like, if I'm putting my academic hat on for a moment, I'm trying to understand. It's like, yeah, there's a bunch of people, there's a whole ecosystem. We both are aware of it as vendor people, of like how this all works, right? And I looked and I sort of scratched my head and I said, all right, so there's that definition, which isn't my definition. When I think about the channel, I typically think about IT solution providers. But as I dug into this, I actually realized that I could kind of come up with like multiple different definitions, right? I could come up with the distributor and vendor channel teams, or the influence channel, like the people that are influencers over buyers. There's the transactional channel, which is those organizations that just do that. We could even go into telco. There's like a retention channel. Like, there's all these definitions of channel. And that's where I immediately said, okay, this is an overloaded term. And I want to make sure that when we're talking and having conversations, if somebody says, oh, we're a channel company, it's like, Well, which channel do you mean? Because at last I checked, I got like 8 or 9 different definitions. Oh, and by the way, and you should, again, listen to my thinking on this in the long form video. There's now this thinking about more around ecosystems and how ecosystems spring up around that, and that there are different players within an ecosystem around it. And I just wanted to highlight the fact that, like, maybe we've beaten this term so badly that it doesn't mean anything anymore. And maybe because it's not meaning anything, there are actually new models springing up, and I want to think about those. So that for me is where my head was going at with that.
A lot of content, man. We had weeks and weeks and weeks of news that we need to catch up on. Dave, where do people find all your podcasts? Where can they watch your videos? Where can they subscribe to all of your stuff?
Well, thanks for that. I love to hear from listeners. I'm on all the podcasting platforms. You look for The Business of Tech. You can go to businessof.tech, which is the website, which has all the news stories. There is a big blue button where you can click on to subscribe to the podcast. You can listen to episodes there, and you can find me on YouTube as well, where I release some of these long form videos if you're interested in editorial content. The likes, the subscribes, they all matter. I really do appreciate all my content's available for free, and I do read and respond to every comment. As I sort of quip, I'm not always right, and I'm okay with that. I do come out with opinions because I think the conversation really matters. But if you think I'm wrong, please tell me.
Stay in touch, Dave. We'll have you back on a little bit later on, and we'll catch up on what's new.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, George.
Have a good one.